These photographs show the victory parades in London on July 19, 1919, the centrepiece of the celebrations marking the end of the First World War. Thousands of soldiers marched past the newly created cenotaph to pay their respects to their fallen comrades. British, French, American, Belgian and Greek troops are all present, as well as men from the British Empire. But what is most striking is who is missing. By the war's end in November 1918, around 15,000 black soldiers had served in the British West Indies Regiment alone. However, no black units were invited to take part in the parade from the West Indies or from Africa. The victory parades took place less than a year after the war had ended, but already black soldiers and their achievements were being deliberately forgotten. Over 100 years later, the Public Statues and Sculpture Association has recorded thousands of statues across the UK. As of January 2024, they found just one named statue of a black British soldier on display in Britain, albeit depicted for his football credentials rather than his military service. And it's not just our public art that fails to tell the full story. A recent YouGov survey revealed that most Britons severely underestimate how long black people have been living in Britain. More than a third of Britons believe that the first black people migrated to Britain within the past 200 years, despite archaeological evidence dating back to Roman times.
There was mountains of history going on that many black people were involved in. So everybody talks about Windrush, 1948. Actually, my great-grandfather was on that first boat in 1911. So there's this conceptual chasm where everybody thinks there were no black people in the UK till 1948.
This is especially true of black British soldiers in the First World War. Despite their service, their stories have been largely forgotten. So, who were the black soldiers who fought for Britain during the First World War? What did they achieve, and why don't we know more about them? When the First World War broke out in 1914, the British Empire was one of the world's greatest powers. A quarter of the world was under its control. To win the war, Britain had to mobilise as many people as possible, and at home and across the Empire, people largely signed up for the same reasons. In the West Indies, for example, many were intensely patriotic and saw it as their duty to fight for king and country. Others saw the war as an opportunity to escape from poverty at home and see the world in the process.
And of course, another reason why some of these men join up, they think that if they come and serve and fight for Britain, Britain will reward them. They will see these guys as having a stake in the empire, but actually deserving some more political representation and some more social rights as well.
One of those men was George Arthur Roberts. He enlisted in the Trinidad Army when war broke out, just a few days after his 23rd birthday, and initially served with the British West Indies Regiment before transferring to the Middlesex Regiment in 1915. However, although many colonial subjects signed up willingly, the British government was less than enthusiastic about recruiting so many black soldiers.
They don't really want to do it. The idea is if these men are signed up in large numbers as soldiers and they get to fight alongside whites and against whites, then this undermines the whole colonial hierarchy, the whole colonial system, which is based on white supremacy. And obviously when these soldiers would come home, the great fear was that they would demand equality and perhaps even independence, and they would know how to fight for it as well.
Those fears were not enough to stop the British from recruiting black troops. As the war grew in scope, more and more men were needed, and so instead of refusing their help, the British placed restrictions on what black soldiers from different places could and could not do. For starters, non-European subjects of the Empire were effectively barred from holding ranks above sergeant. Some did manage to flout those rules, especially later in the war, but those cases were rare. Black colonial units were barred from fighting on the Western Front. For the men of the British West Indies Regiment, such as George Arthur Roberts, that came as quite a shock.
It wasn't a fighting regiment, and they were expected to do things like clean latrines and things like that. He said to himself, I've got no prospects of doing anything. And war, although it had the risk of death, was obviously a way out for a young, ambitious man at the start of the 20th century. So he saw an exit and he took it. And I think transitioned to the Middlesex sometime around 1915. I guess you would call a white regiment, a fighting regiment, which at that time would have made him pretty unique as a black man. It's the same regiment Walter Tull was a member of. He was the first mixed-race man to be made an officer of a British regiment, and that was pretty unique, those two men. He was able to pick up a bomb in his bare hands and throw it back over enemy lines to a distance of around 74 yards. He rose to the rank of staff sergeant, so again he achieved this fairly unique rank. He was injured on the Somme and furloughed out of the army in 1916.
While white South Africans fought in their thousands, black South Africans didn't even get the chance to sign up as soldiers. Instead, they were confined to labour battalions. In particular, the South African Native Labour Corps, and were completely segregated from other Allied soldiers and even from French civilians.
These men again did some vital labouring jobs. They were unloading ships in harbours, building railways, building roads, felling trees. It's always logistics. Logistics is key. If you can't keep the railways, the roads, etc. running, you can't unload the ships, you can't have the army fighting.
This is one of the reasons that black stories are so often forgotten in the First World War. We tend to remember the fighting soldier rather than the people behind the lines, and that's the role that black soldiers were forced to take on the Western Front. The exception to this rule was the Indian Army, which held a special place in the colonial racial hierarchy. Indian troops helped save the Allies from defeat on the Western Front in 1914, before being gradually moved to the Middle East. In contrast, the French were happy to use their colonial troops on the Western Front when the situation demanded it. After heavy losses in 1914 and 1915, West and North African troops played a key part in defending Paris. But the British, despite a shortage in manpower after the disastrous offensive on the Somme, always put racial considerations first. Even future Prime Minister Winston Churchill couldn't convince the authorities to let black soldiers fight on the Western Front. This was supposed to be a white man's war. In Africa, it was a completely different story.
We can't send regular army soldiers because they're needed in France, so we need locally raised troops, supported by hundreds and hundreds of thousands of African men, women and sometimes children in the support role, carrying the supplies, carrying the ammunition. And that's why the African soldier actually got to fight those campaigns. It was out of necessity, but also the fact that they were fighting primarily other Africans.
It was a similar story for the British West Indies Regiment. A small contingent joined British forces in East Africa, and 2 battalions joined the fight against the Turks in the Middle East. Once again, they were only able to fight there because the enemy they were fighting was seen as a non-white, non-European enemy.
And this is where the British West Indies Regiment gets a chance to actually do what the men signed up to do, which was to fight in the front line as infantry alongside Australians and New Zealanders in 1918 and take a number of Turkish positions in a very successful attack. Unfortunately, for the majority of that British West Indies Regiment, they never got that opportunity. When these men were fighting, they were generally fighting in areas which we haven't looked at. The British focus has always really been Western Front. So that's why these stories have traditionally been neglected and quite often totally forgotten.
When the end of the war arrived in 1918, many colonial troops were expecting to finally receive some reward for their service. But for the British West Indies Regiment, that did not come to pass. First, they were denied a pay rise given to the rest of the British Army on the basis they were so-called native troops. Then, in December, they were concentrated into the port of Taranto in Italy for demobilisation, but were badly mistreated.
When they arrive, they find that many of the recreational facilities in the camp are off limits to them. It's for whites only. They are then given the job of digging latrines for Italian labourers. Now you can imagine that men who have signed up as British soldiers find that an absolute disgrace. And there's a riot in Taranto, and the British West Indies Regiment men, it's suppressed by armed soldiers, they're disarmed, and then they're very, very quickly shipped back to the Caribbean and demobilised as quickly as possible.
The men of the British West Indies Regiment got their pay rise, but they were now seen as a threat to British colonial rule. Armed guards would greet them on their return to the Caribbean. Meanwhile, in Africa, many of those pre-war promises were not kept. Pensions were lower than that of white British soldiers. Medical provisions were negligible, and that all-important land granted to returning soldiers in the Caribbean was often of poor quality or so remote that it was impossible to bring goods to market.
Their wartime service was seen as something inconvenient to remember by the political authorities, because if you reward these men for their service too much, the argument was they would start to want political and social reform.
Those who were able to settle in England also faced a struggle.
He talks about his disappointment at when he came back from World War I. All the promises that had been made about homes fit to live in and jobs and all the rewards that soldiers were going to get never materialised. And it really was destitution. These guys were coming back from World War I and they had nothing. They didn't have homes, they didn't have jobs. So it really was a sort of scrape out of the trenches into this dreadful life.
Not content with having done his part in the First World War, Roberts continued to think of others after the war ended. He became a founding member of the League of Coloured Peoples, one of the first civil rights groups campaigning for racial equality in Britain.
We have a picture of him as one of the executive members of the Federation of Discharged and Demobilised Sailors and Soldiers, then founded the Camberwell branch of the British Legion. For the rest of his life, he completely devoted himself to veterans' affairs, and in World War II was a firefighter during the Blitz. We have to be nothing but proud. He died in 1970, and here we are 50 years later, finally catching up with this guy's achievements. His achievements weren't really celebrated in his lifetime. It all got buried. Don't erase our history, build it up. Let's all learn from our pasts. Young people today can look at those stories and hold up their heads and say, yeah, we've got as rich a history as anyone else.